So, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it.
Today, as we light the candle of peace, we are reminded of the peace that comes to our hearts through the shining light of Christ. Our broken world seeks moments of fleeting peace and absence of conflict, but as we light this candle of peace, we are reminded of the true peace, the everlasting, eternal peace that comes only through the light of Christ and the grace so freely given to us by God.
A reading from the prophet Isaiah this morning is chapter 40, verses 3 through 5. Familiar yet very important words for us to recall at this holy time of year. A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. And the uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places will become as a plain. And then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and the people shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken to us." Amen. A reading from the gospel this morning is from the gospel according to Luke. And this is a story about the birth of John the Baptist. Now, in the Advent story, John the Baptist is always a focus. And I've been a minister now for 45 years, and I've never preached about John the Baptist at Advent time. It just didn't seem Christmassy. But it's an important story for us to hear, and so this is going to be a little bit about this text. In the days of King Herod of Judah, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and the regulations of the Lord. But they had no children. Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Once when he was serving as priest before God, and his section was on duty, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Now, at the time of the incense offering, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside. And then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing at the right hand of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. And Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He must never drink wine or strong drink. Even before his birth, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. He will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God with the spirit and the power of Elijah. He will go before their children and turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting along in years." And then the angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you, and now I bring you this good news. But because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak until the day these things occur." Meanwhile, the people who were waiting for Zechariah and wondered at his delay in the sanctuary, when he did not come out, he could not speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the sanctuary. He kept motioning to them, but he remained unable to speak. And when the time of service ended, he went to his home. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me, when he looked favorably upon me and took away the disgrace that I have endured among my people." Thus ends this reading of God's holy word. There's a book that the Presbyterian denomination has promoted to utilize during this season of Advent. And the author, whose name is Erin, female, E-R-I-N, Erin Watham, she tells the story of fear, how she came to see fear in her life. She and her husband were celebrating their 15th anniversary. They were in the mountains of Colorado. Beautiful, beautiful, peaceful, quiet evening. You know, when you're up in the mountains, those mountains kind of, they shorten the days because sunset happens so much earlier. The sun goes behind the mountains and it gets darker earlier. And so they were on one of those early evenings that comes earlier in the mountains, and it's just beautifully quiet and peaceful, and they're just enjoying it. And suddenly, it's so quiet, they realize that they're not alone. And so then they hear it, this low thump, thump, thump. And it seems to be getting a little bit louder. And the neighboring cabin has one of those motion lights on the side of it. And something sets off that light. And so they were able to see. It was this huge brown bear. And instinctively they knew, though they were afraid. They couldn't run. They couldn't scream. They had to just be quiet. And they also knew that they had to quiet their bodies. Somehow show that they weren't afraid. And so they knew that technique, that breathing technique, to just take a slow, long breath in and then let it out slowly. And they did that a couple of times, and they were calmed. And they looked over at the bear that was getting a little bit closer, and in fact, so it was so close that they could smell that musty bear smell. And they could see the bear's breath. and the cool mountain air. And they watched, and they noticed through the breath that the bear was moving on away. Pretty scary, huh? Pretty scary for me. So what are your fears? What are those things that you might be afraid of? We heard from some of the kids some of the things that they're afraid of, and we all have them. They might be critters. Don't have many bear around here. Sometimes we hear about a mountain lion that might roam through the area, but not too scared of them. We don't see those. Snake, maybe that bothers some people, maybe not others. Spiders, mice, bats. They're those things that we're afraid of, those critters sometimes, and we find out ways to deal with them. I remember a fear I had when I was about 14 years old. Next door neighbor had a large German shepherd. I was walking home from school one day. The dog somehow had gotten out. I was a block from our house. He came charging toward me and took a hunk out of my arm. It's fearful sight. And I remember getting a little nervous around big dogs after that. But I never thought about a connection with an earlier instance in my life, about 4 or 5 years earlier, with my own dog. We had an English Springer Spaniel growing up. His name was Prince. Great dog, stayed outside all the time. And he, one day, was outside with Prince, and he kind of turned on me. And he snapped at me and growled at me. And I was always a little afraid of Prince after that, but I never really thought too much about it until just recently and thought, okay. I thought about it because I had heard a story or read a story about English Springer Spaniels, and that there's some problem with genetics in some English Springer Spaniels, that breed of dogs, that somehow sometimes makes them act in that way. And that helps. That helps me to know that he wasn't a bad dog, he wasn't mad at me, but there was something in his genes that made him do what he did. So there are other fears that we have. Sometimes people don't like to be in small spaces. You get in an elevator with a bunch of people, that might make you afraid. If you ever been to the Capitol and ride those elevators up there, those can be kind of scary. Sometimes people don't like to be in wide open spaces. That's kind of another problem that people have. Sometimes people are afraid of heights. That's a fear for me. I don't like driving those mountain roads along the edges and looking over. No, thank you. For 5 summers in a row, I go to the UP of Michigan for 2 weeks to preach. A little church up there. It's a great little church, and you stay in their house right on the northern tip of Lake Huron. But to connect from the UP of Michigan to the lower peninsula of Michigan, there's a 5-mile bridge. Mackinac Bridge. And there's water below it, but you're up high and you're on those metal, grates driving across it. And every time I go get ready to go on that, my, hands get a little sweaty, and it's just something you don't like. But again, that breathing, trying to relax, thinking, okay, I can conquer this. There are those fears that we have in our lives. And sometimes they're in fact, they can be a lot worse, a lot more serious. We might have incidents in our own families or in our own lives of health issues, and we're afraid of what that might mean for us or for our loved ones. We have situations in our nation and our world of violence, and the story of what's happened this week in New York City is so disturbing on many different levels. The fears that we carry with us are important to recognize. And that's what this story about the birth of John the Baptist is telling us. Again, it's one of 300 times in the Bible where we hear, "Do not be afraid." But this was the first time in Luke's gospel where those words are said. And so we hear the story of what happens and how Zechariah and Elizabeth had been married a long time, and how they both had this great, important pedigree. I mean, Elizabeth was related to Aaron, Moses' brother, who was the founder of the Levite priestly tradition. She was grounded in the faith. And her husband, Zechariah, he was one of the priests working in the temple. And on this particular time, he was there on duty. His group was on duty working in the temple. And he happened to be chosen to be the one to go inside the temple in the Holy of Holies to present the incense on this celebration, a great honor. And we're told that in the story, this large gathering of people were present. It was an important holy time. And the people were present and they were praying. But if you've ever seen pictures or seen clips of people at the Wailing Wall of the temple, the west wall of the temple, how it's not peaceful in church praying. It's people, just throwing their hands down and yelling almost. And it's a very chaotic scene. And so Zechariah goes inside the Holy of Holies. He's out of that chaotic scene. He finds that peace, and he goes ready to present the incense on the altar for the incense where it's presented. And as he steps up to make his presentation, somebody's there. He steps back, and it's the angel. And the angel speaks to him and tells him that he's bringing good news to him. Don't be afraid. Well, the good news that the angel, who we learn is named Gabriel, oftentimes that's the angel that we encounter in the Bible, especially in the text about the birth of Jesus. And Gabriel says, don't be afraid, because I'm bringing good news to you. That thing that you and Elizabeth have wanted your whole lives, to have a child, God's going to make that happen. And your child is going to be great. Your child is going to be recognized. Your child is going to be the one to bring in God's rule on this earth. And Zechariah says, well, thank you, but we're old. I don't think this is going to work. We've been trying to have kids our whole lives, and we're past that. Well, there are a lot of thoughts probably that were going through Zechariah's mind that didn't make it into the words of Luke. I mean, yeah, they were old, and so wondered about the biology of how things were going to work, but also then they wondered, they were comfortable. I mean, if you've ever had the opportunity to have children or grandchildren with you for a week of time or whatever, you think, okay, there's a reason why I'm a grandparent, not a parent now. So they were at that stage. They weren't ready to be parents. They thought that ship had sailed. They weren't going to do that. And they were okay with it at that point. He thought, I think the thing he thought about the most was Elizabeth. I mean, now we know the science of medicine and that childbirth is risky for anyone, but as women get older, it's riskier, both for the mother and for the child. And how would Elizabeth stand up to that at her age? And even if she did survive it, how would John, their baby, how would he fare? Those were all things that he worried about when he heard this announcement. And so Gabriel said, okay, you don't believe me. And so you're going to be mute. You will not be able to speak a word until this happens. Meanwhile, the other priests, all of the gathered assembly who were out by the Wailing Wall praying, started to wonder, what happened to Zechariah? He's been gone quite a while now. And so eventually Zechariah comes back outside and people ask him, what's going on? You look different. And can't speak. I'm imagining charades, okay? All right? So, what does he do? If he can't speak, he comes out, an angel, okay? Somebody comes up, wings, and speaks to me and says something about a baby, and my wife's going to have a baby, and this baby's going to be great and bring God's rule. How does he communicate this thing? And some crazy reason, the thought came to my mind, it's almost funny. Okay, what if you had a particular characters, comedians, play that role of Zechariah and Elizabeth? And this is for some older ones here, but you'll remember Archie and Edith Bunker. And could you imagine if Archie was Zechariah and this had happened and he goes home to Edith and he can't say a word and he's trying to do charades and act this out and say what's going to happen, and Edith is looking confused and like, get this and what's going on, and it's just funny. And there had to be some humor to this, but somehow they got beyond the fear and they got beyond the humor and they did what needed to happen. And Elizabeth conceived this son. And during that time, as she was getting used to this news, about halfway through her pregnancy, then she has a visit. A visit from another mother, Mary, who comes to see her cousin, her older cousin, Elizabeth. And they come to share their miracle stories and their fears. And a lot of times when we're afraid, if somebody else shares a fear, if somebody else has gone through what we're going through, it helps. And that happened here. They brought strength to each other. in our culture as we're celebrating Christmas. There are a few stories that have kind of bad guys in them. People that you fear. The Grinch, that's a bad guy. Ebenezer Scrooge, another bad guy. If you watch the real old one, It's a Wonderful Life. Mr. Potter, he's a real bad guy. But what is it that we fear about them? I think deep down, the thing that we fear about them is that we would become like them. We hear in the hymns of this season about the coming of the light, the coming of God's love, the coming of God into our midst to somehow bring that darkness out of us and to fill it with God's light. And that's what needs to happen. That's what Advent is all about. Not just coming into the world, not just the story, the history of what happened in Bethlehem, but coming into our hearts, coming into our lives, making it so that we will never be an Ebenezer Scrooge or a Grinch or a Mr. Potter, but that we will be instruments of God's love. Amen.